mapped by the Pareto distribution. It's an expression of what's been known among economists as the Matthew principle from the New Testament. To those who have everything, more will be given. From those who have nothing, everything will be taken away. And it's an iron law of the distribution of success in hierarchy. So if you're going to have value and you're going to have hierarchy, then you're going to have inequality. And that's a problem. Now, you can't, so now you have a political divide there. So the conservative types say, well, we need the hierarchies. And that's self-evident as far as I'm concerned, given that set of propositions, because if you're going to pursue something of value, which you have to and need to, then you're going to produce a hierarchy. So if you demolish the hierarchies, you demolish value itself, and that's not a tenable move. The left wing, though, says, and to their credit, yeah, but you have to be very careful with your hierarchies because they tend towards inequality of distribution. That's one problem. Once they're established, they always also tend to a form of tyranny, because once a hierarchy of competence has been established, it can be invaded by people who use power as the means to attain status in the hierarchy. And that can corrupt and destroy even the entire hierarchy. So you have to be on guard for that. Plus, if your hierarchy becomes too steep in its distribution, so it's too tiny a fraction of people at the top and too great an agglomeration of people at the bottom, especially under conditions of genuine privation, then the people at the bottom, it's not only unjust and unfair and producing excess suffering, but the people at the bottom have nothing to lose and might as well just flip the hierarchy on its end. And that's not a good way to produce a sustainable society. You don't want to put people in a position where they have nothing to lose, especially if you have something to lose, but also just with regards to principles of like fairness and justice, let's say. So it seems to me that that's a decent way of conceptualizing the political landscape, and that gives you a conceptual framework within which you can put people on the left and right in their proper position. The right basically is that portion of the population that's whose temperamental proclivity is to admire and support hierarchies and work effectively within them. And that's actually the personality traits that make up a conservative. Because conservatives by temperament are low in trait openness, which is a creativity dimension that's associated with lateral thinking. It's not, I would say it's very environmentally underdetermined. It's a biological predisposition, especially with regards to creativity. And high in conscientiousness. And the conservative temperamental types make very good managers and administrators. That's how they manifest themselves in the world. Essentially, if you set up a hierarchy and it runs algorithmically, then the conservatives will do very well in that structure because they can implement an algorithm and they're very good at implementing. Whereas the liberal types are very good at generating new hierarchies. And that's because they're high in trait openness. They're less conscientious, so they're not suited as well to within hierarchy operation. But in a functioning economy and in a functioning democracy, I would say, you need both types. You need the liberal types to establish new territory and to put out new values so that new hierarchies might be organized, so that effective movement towards those ends might be instantiated. And you need the conservatives to actually implement the processes. And so a society of only conservatives becomes static, and that's not good because the environment transforms and you have to keep up with it. And a society that's only composed of the left-leaning liberal types is very good at generating all sorts of new possibilities, but very bad at generating all sorts of new actualities. And so we should be, first of all, cognizant of the fact that hierarchical organization is inescapable if you're also going to pursue value. Second, that if you produce hierarchical structures, that you're going to produce inequality inevitably, and there are negative consequences as a function of that, and that both sides of that equation, let's say, need a voice, because both of those functions are valuable, necessary, but also at odds with one another, and at permanent odds, because it is the case that you need hierarchies, because otherwise you have nothing to do. And it's also the case that if you have hierarchies, then the poor will always be with you. And that's a chronic functional problem that has to be addressed. And that's the proper place, I would say, of the left. So that's only 15 minutes. So, but I'm actually, I'm going to stop there, I think, and you can chew on those propositions and see what you think of those. But I'm really interested actually in having a discussion with all of you, and would be happy to start the question period a little earlier than might otherwise be necessary.
Yeah, there were just some flying inferential leaps at the end there, right? So I mean, I guess the first thing to note is the real sign that this is 2018 Peterson, you know, it's larval Peterson, as you say, is that he's trying to do this highbrow both sidesism.
Also, his carapace is still shiny.
Right, exactly. And you know, and he has, you know, like he's sort of operating in this position where he's giving an impression that he's like a little bit above the fray of sort of day-to-day political battles, and he can kind of, you know, see where everybody fits into the grand scheme of things. Whereas, you know, 2024, Jordan Peterson is just a conservative pundit. But yeah, on the actual substance of his argument, he, you know, he went from talking about hierarchies of competence to making these claims about how people are biologically liberals or conservatives, which I just want to say really explicitly, like, look, there's suggestive psychological research on the, you know, link between, you know, personality types and political preferences and all that. Like, it's not like there's nothing there, but like just the way that he's confidently asserting this, it's like, oh, this is, you know, this is just this biological fact about people is.
Yeah. And that's, he reifies his tools. So you have this big 5 psychological trait survey instrument, which rates people based on, it's like neuroticism, openness, conscientiousness, agreeableness. Did I say that already?
Yeah.
And something else. And these are the Peterson reasoning goes that these are durable, that you give the same person tests at a different point in their life, they'll score the same on these measurements, that they're predictive. You can figure out all kinds of characteristics about a person based on their scores on those 5 aspects, and implicitly, right, that they're biologically grounded, they're genetic or something.
Yeah, I mean, in what we just saw, right? I mean, he's saying that, like, actually be, you know, like having a conservative temperament or a leftist temperament is biological. There's very little environmental there, which is, it's a very small point, but I really want to underline this. Like,
which
this cannot possibly be something he would be in a position to know. Nobody is.
Also, the conclusion, if you get to late stage Peterson, where, right, like the political war is on, if there's a biological distinction between liberals and conservatives, right, like, I don't want to, the conclusion,
yeah, how do you feel about
you
women?
really think that liberals are really, really, really bad and they're ruining everything, and you can't convince them because it's just the way they are, well, maybe they shouldn't be.
Right. Yeah. No. So I also just wanted to flag, like, in the last few minutes of that, especially, right? Like he does this, you know, like, honestly, right after we started playing again, he started saying all this stuff about, well, you know, the left, to be fair, they have some good points about how, you know, too much hierarchy is, you know, can lead to these bad consequences if it's, you know, there's not enough upward mobility, or, you know, the people at the bottom are being ground down too brutally or whatever. And he was already doing the thing that I said he was going to do, which is slip and slide between hierarchy in the sense of unequal distribution of competence or skill, and hierarchy in the distribution of, you know, wealth or power, which, you know, are just separate issues. I mean, you know, if or how those things are linked is a question of, you know, what the social institutions of your society are.
Precisely. He has this model where there is a free and fair tournament or exam or something. There's some objective test of competence in which people are rated and then wealth and power distributed based on those results. And ex post facto, you can use the distribution of wealth and power to infer what the results of individuals would be, right? Like, oh, this guy has all the money, he must be the smartest or the best, you know. And the idea that somebody may be the best at something, but that something might not be what you want to award wealth and power for, including wealth and power accumulation, right? Like the people who are really, really, really good at it probably need to be stopped from being that good at it, right? There are certain ways to get at those outcomes, which he implies come from some kind of constructive brilliance, whether it's, you know, entrepreneurs changing the world or smart people making decisions. You know, it can be entrepreneurs changing the world for the worse, just being very, very good at accumulating numbers, or smart people accumulating power through things that are entirely socially corrosive.
Right.
Now, he just takes it for granted, right? It's a completely unexamined premise that the hierarchies of competence that he's positing somehow overlap with social utility. Right? He talked about utility in the previous clip, and that's a hidden premise, hidden axiom, to use his
he loves
his
that
language. Yeah, it's an axiom of his worldview, one which actually he's willing to dispense if he has to talk about a system he doesn't like, right? But because the people who are excellent in that system are clearly monsters. But without it, it's just word salad, because there's no connection between the outcomes of wealth and power that he seems to be defending, the unequal distribution of wealth and power, and the competence part of it.
Yeah, exactly. That so there's social utility point, and then there's also just the actual material outcome for those people, right? Like that you know, some people be better at things than others, unless the thing that you're talking about is literally just being good at accumulating wealth. And you know, there's no necessary connection between that and you know, material success, even in the case of being good at generating material wealth, right? Like the world is, you know, there are lots of people in the world who have lots of material wealth and aren't particularly good at accumulating it, except in the trivial sense that they were, you know, they have the skill of being born into the right family.
Donald Trump, for instance, right? If he had just parked everything into an index fund,
right,
that he was given.
Yes. Yeah. Right. You know, he would actually have had more money than, you know, than he had at the end of his business career. Yeah. Right. So it's like there are lots of people like that, and that's like, even, you know, under capitalism. I mean, just sort of, you know, stating it as if it's a trans-historical fact that just in general, right, hierarchies of competence are going to translate themselves into hierarchies of wealth and power, you know, is pretty wild, you know, because one, you're certainly excluding a priori the possibility of a society where, you know, if like a more egalitarian society, which, I understand he's not a fan of that possibility, but, would be nice to hear some substantive arguments against it that don't rely on just sort of assuming at the outset of the discussion that that's not possible. And two, because of lots of societies that have existed that are less egalitarian than capitalism, and where the connection between any sort of skill at all, right, and wealth or power was much more tenuous, right? That obviously lots of people got more wealth and power, under feudalism, for example, by, being good at military conquest or whatever. But, in societies like that, you had many more people who enjoyed those things without having to be good at anything, right? Because of the structure of the society. And this is really worth harping on, because at the end of his initial presentation, he said, well, as long as you have hierarchy, the poor will always be with us. It's like, and this really is a head spinning leap, because remember, the hierarchy he started out talking about, the hierarchy that he said is like
hierarchy of competence,
part of the fabric of the natural world, is hierarchy of competence. So as long as you have hierarchies of competence, you have to have poverty. That's at the very least, it would be nice to slow down and see the steps in that argument.
I think I can imagine what he's getting at, and the mirror image of the wealth of the rich demonstrates their excellence. Their validates their place at the top of the hierarchy. In his popular writing and in some of his other public statements, there's the mirror image contempt of the people at the bottom, that if you are struggling, then it's a result of insufficient IQ or maladaptive traits or just your personal failures of character. And that's why he says the poor will always be with us. He means the sort of poor in spirit and competence. And he also can't imagine that if somebody is struggling, that they could find a place where they would be productive, right? That they could turn things around without becoming a Peterson disciple.
Yeah. And it is really worth emphasizing here that he's, that he, like many conservatives, he's kind of not capable of getting what people who have substantively different, values and worldviews even care about, right? Like that, because when he was sort of trying to give the left some credit, he was talking about hierarchies that are like, too rigid, right? But the idea that, that there are people who have some sort of normative concern about people who are doing badly, other than making sure that they can climb up to the top if they're among the best and the brightest, is just totally foreign, right? That we should have a better society for everybody, not just sort of grease the wheels of the meritocracy to make sure that the right people are able to rise to the top, or that the tournament is being conducted in a fair enough way, right? I mean, this is, there's really he doesn't even seem to, when he talks about hierarchy, he doesn't even seem to have a notion that you need institutions that make sure you get the right hierarchy. Instead, he's just like, well, if there's too much hierarchy, then you can't change, but everything is fine the way it is too. Yeah. Yeah, good thing we don't have that problem. Yeah, no, he thinks that, again, like at most he can imagine people objected to too much hierarchy because it might make it harder to climb to the top of the mountain, not because, you have any sort of concern about everybody who's not going to climb to the top of the mountain. I mean, that's just kind of off the mental map of Meaden entirely. Yeah, and I guess, I don't know, my only other thought about this was, thinking about the idea that poverty, is should sort of default be taken as a result of defects of character. Is thinking about a stat that I looked up today for something that I was writing, which is what the white and black poverty rates are in the United States. That's 8.6% for white people and 17.1% for black people. And, it's the sort of thing that I think does really, cause a problem for conservatives who don't want to be that kind of conservative. Because is just bad moral character inversely correlated with melanin? I mean, how does this work?
The whole character game, and this becomes it becomes part of the conservative package, because you can make it hereditary without making it genetic. And you make it hereditary by implying that it's absent fathers, broken families, and those people, like the parents are bad, so the kids are bad.
Mm-hmm.
And you end up with the same de facto caste division of the worthy and the unworthy. You also get to make it heritable, but you don't have to go through the biological route, which is why Jordan Peterson gets into a little bit of trouble when he insists on the biological nature of personality traits or of hierarchy. And then when you confront him with a fact like that, it's much harder for him to deke back into, well, those are individual. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. All right. Let's continue forward. This is actually exciting. So, this is supposed to be a debate breakdown, but because there was so much interestingly wrong with the parts that were just Peterson talking, we haven't actually gotten to anybody else talking. So we're about to, to watch some Oxford students step into the arena.
All right. So, thank you. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking. So now we'll move on to some questions. I will ask 2 initial questions and then open up to the audience in order to ensure that as many people as possible have a chance of asking questions. So my first question is, political correctness is a rather vague term that refers to a wide range of issues, from preventing explicitly racist hate speech to calling out someone for wearing culturally insensitive clothes. Do you think that we should universally reject political correctness, or is there a line that can be drawn?
Well, that was the other thing I was thinking about talking about tonight, and I'm actually having a debate in Canada about that very proposition tomorrow. So here's what I've been thinking about that. I'm trying to formulate my thoughts for my 6-minute initial opening remarks tomorrow. It's a very tight time constraint. So think about it this way. Imagine that you need to describe the world in order to perceive the world and to act in it, both of those, not just to act in it, but also to perceive it, and that you need a description at different levels of resolution. And you can think about how you use your computer when you're dealing with images. There are some times when what you really need is a thumbnail, because it doesn't require much processing power, and it's sufficiently representative of the reality so that you can do whatever you need to do with the image, with the thumbnail. And you never replace the thumbnail with a high-resolution image if the thumbnail will do. I really like that. I don't think it's an analogy. I actually think it's a description of a very large number of cognitive operations. And maybe there's a rule of thumb, which is never use a high-resolution theory when a low-resolution theory will do. The converse is also true, by the way. So then let's say that in order to orient ourselves properly in society, we need a general-purpose, low-resolution theory, existential theory, something like that. It's not precisely a description of the objective world. It's more like an agreed-upon it's an agreed-upon narrative about how the world is constructed in relationship to human experience and how we should act in the world. So how we should look at ourselves, how we should look at history, how we should look at our social being so that we can coexist peacefully, so that we can move forward, so that our societies function. And then imagine that that comes in broadly two forms, and I think it does. One is a collectivist form, and I would say that that collectivist form is built very deeply into human nature. It's essentially a tribal outlook. It's an outlook that you can trace back hundreds of thousands of years, and perhaps more deeply than that. We know, for example, that chimpanzees have a tribal outlook, and that chimpanzees will patrol the borders of their tribes looking for chimpanzees who aren't of the tribe, and when they find them, they will tear them into pieces. And so that was revealed by Jane Goodall in the 1970s. It was very shocking to everyone when that was first discovered, because there was a very influential line of thinking, mostly derived from people who were influenced by Rousseau, that human beings were innately good and that only culture made them cruel and capable of atrocity. But the fact that the chimpanzees patrol their borders and tear apart their enemies really did that theory in a very serious way. So at least made it more complicated. So the collectivist view is essentially that the best way to conceptualize what a human being is to look at what tribe they belong to. And the tribe might be, well, this is one of the problems with the collectivist view, is which of your tribal allegiances is to be paramount. And that's actually a fatal problem, by the way, because there's an infinite number of ways you can be categorized, and it isn't obvious which of those tribal allegiances should be canonical, and hence the rise of intersectionality, which is something that's a dragon that will eat its own tail, certainly. But there's a notion there. It's like the most important thing forget about that for a minute. We'll say, well, the most important thing about you is your group, your gender, your sex, your race, your ethnicity, all of the multiple categories that we're supposed to be considering as fundamental realities now. And that the best way to construe reality is that it's a battleground between those groups for dominance, power. And that's the postmodern ethos, and it's a pretty decent thumbnail sketch of reality. You can sum it up quite quickly. You can use it as a guide to action in all sorts of domains. It has its consequences, however. And one of the consequences is that it's tribal. And tribal identities tend towards mayhem. Now, the alternative low-resolution view is the view that I think has been articulated most effectively in the West, and perhaps of all the places where it's been most effectively articulated in the West, the most effective articulation has come from the UK. I mean, there's something remarkable about what your country has done with regards to laying out the idea of individual sovereignty in a fully articulated manner, in a way that allows a political system to arise predicated on the assumption that the individual is of intrinsic value. And if you need a thumbnail view of the world, the most effective thumbnail view of the world isn't that you're the member of a tribe, even though in many ways you are, and the member of many tribes. The most effective thumbnail view is that you're to be regarded as a sovereign individual, and you're to treat other people that way as well, both with regards to their rights, but even more importantly, and often forgotten, with regards to their responsibilities. And I think that polities that are based on the first set of presuppositions, the tribal, degenerate into precisely what you'd expect, which is tribal warfare. And the second have the possibility of blooming into exactly what they have bloomed into, which are the most functional societies, the most peaceful societies, the most successful societies, the societies that are the best at generating wealth along with inequality that the world has ever seen. And so I would say we sacrifice the latter to the former at our great peril. And I would also say that, and this is something that I'm very ashamed of, is that the universities, broadly speaking, are doing absolutely everything they can as fast as they possibly can to ensure that we sacrifice the sovereign individual view for the collective tribal view. And I think that is appalling beyond forgiveness. And so that's what I think about political correctness.
Jordan, I didn't hear an answer there.
He goes from right and left to hierarchy and equality, and now he's at his collectivism versus sovereign individual moment. And I think that there is a intellectual genealogy to the idea of individual rights, or the person as an individual. I think that intellectual history goes through the West and includes a great deal of philosophical, religious, moral work. Now, positing, he's kind of implying that John Locke, or whoever he would consider to be the great progenitor of the Anglo-liberal tradition, basically solved the chimpanzee problem, and everybody else is still in chimp land, right? China, collectivism, chimps. India, collectivism, chimps. Marxists, collectivism, chimps. Postmodernists, collectivism, chimps. And he might actually believe that. I realize that this will come as no shock to anyone, but Jordan Peterson is extraordinarily narrow in his cultural view. He only really thinks of the West, with the USSR as Mordor to in his Lord of the Rings cosplay, and he gives extraordinarily short shrift to developments in other parts of the world and historical periods that aren't the great age of Western expansion and growth. And he says that Western societies are the best, the most peaceful. And it's like, well, look, man, the one hashtag not all Westerners, not all white. Some of the places that have what one might imagine he thinks of as the best outcomes are socialist hellholes in Scandinavia, right? Like the exact places where he believes that the intellectual blueprint for free society has been shredded. And if Western civilization is so great, then why do so many Westerners have an issue with Jordan Peterson, right? Like he elides the fact that there's a huge debate around what the history and the heritage mean. And there's all kinds of things that you can look for if you go back in English history alone, right? Like I think it was John Dee, who was the king's alchemist or something and wrote great grimoires on witchcraft. Why isn't he foregrounding that as the contribution of the Anglo-Saxons? Maybe the reason why the UK got to have its empire has nothing to do with individualism and their sovereign political constitution, but because John Dee had the most effective pact with Satan. it all comes down to finding a way to pin everything on the left.
Yeah, it's also like, I mean, does the left in this conception, I mean, just come out of nowhere? I mean, like this has always been what's struck me as very strange about Peterson's way of talking about the West, or Anglo societies, whatever. That, like, look, you really want to position yourself as a defender of the West, then shouldn't you be defending it against something non-Western? Like, I don't know, Buddhism, right? Get mad at Buddhism. Like it's not, because it's like all of these trends that Peterson is actually mad at are ones that have deep roots in the Western tradition. I mean, Marxism, obviously. And but like even all the stuff about political correctness, it's like he doesn't think, he thinks political correctness is just this, random reversion back to some sort of, non-Anglosphere kind of tribalism. It's he doesn't think that has roots in liberalism. Like
well, I think that the fact that it's political correctness,
yeah,
and the cultural term of the left that really gets his ire up is not coincidental, because it's through the discourse of multiculturalism, decolonization, anti-colonization, anti-imperialism, that you have large groups of non-whites, non-Westerners, and women that adapt the leftist tradition, the very Western leftist tradition, into forms that he finds particularly threatening. And I think that that's not coincidental, because those are groups that Jordan Peterson, which he'll admit the gender stuff, but he's a little cagier on race, so I don't want to
Sure.
This is just my opinion of what he might think, but he perceives them as outside of the Western tradition and bearing that chimp mind virus of collectivism.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it just, this always drives me crazy, because it's like what they're talking about here is political correctness. I suppose if this had happened in the last couple of years rather than 2018, wokeness, right? That's, but it's like, look, he's, what really they're talking about is like a certain strand in kind of left liberal cultural politics, right? That's like kind of what he's getting at. And that's stuff that has, I think it's more defensible and it's less defensible points. There's even a conservative or libertarian critique you could make of some of that stuff that is not how I would do it, but I don't think it's crazy, right? Like I can see, I could maybe see some of the point, but he's not giving that, and it's really, I mean, I think it is actually kind of important that he didn't answer the original question, because the original question was, oh, should you just reject political correctness outright, or is like some of it okay, basically? Is there a line to be drawn? And there was never a point where he really even pretended to be answering that question. Instead, what he just did is like, here's why political correctness is the devil. But even as the question was set up, right, there was stuff about well, okay, could be anything from political correctness, could be anything from sort of opposing outright hate speech to getting mad about Halloween costumes, something like that in the setup, right? And Peterson could have made some distinctions there, and he could have even related it to what he wanted to say about liberal individualism. But I mean, this is whatever. Maybe this is just the mature Peterson, you know, already poking through the larva, you know, that it's like he's just, you know, he's too mad about the blue-haired social justice kids to make any sort of distinction or like grant any kind of complexity here.
Yeah, I think that he has a particular reading of Marx, and what it really comes down to is Nietzsche. I can't remember if he quoted him already or if that's yet to come, but I believe that he would characterize political correctness and wokeness, intersectionality as forms of a kind of ressentiment-driven slave morality. That where, because of historical oppression or suffering, certain groups are sanctified, and he doesn't like that because they're not the excellent ones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it does strike me that a lot of the targets of his critique might not be as you know, distant from all of his most basic assumptions as he assumes they are, right? Like you know, a lot of the the PC college kids he hates are, you know, I mean, fundamentally they do have a conception of social justice that's about, you know, making sure, because they do actually have a baseline commitment to a certain kind of individualistic liberalism, that that the best and the brightest can rise to the top from marginalized groups, and that we need to be vigilant to stop arbitrary forms of prejudice and oppression precisely so that can happen, right? You know, and you know, but he sort of thinks everybody is a Marxist, but he also thinks that Marxism is something that has absolutely nothing to do with like the history of Enlightenment thought that he's celebrating, you know, when he's talking about England. So Jordan Peterson is very confused, I guess, is the top line point here. But let's maybe do one more question and then break and go to the post game.
All right, thank you. Thank you. As a follow-up question, so your conception of truth, as you said, is tailored to what helps us survive and live. Doesn't that also mean that your approach to the meaning of truth is very similar to one of a postmodernist, which are a group of people you so clearly denounce?
That's a good question. It's wrong, but it's a good question. Well, look, you always have to give the devil his due. And there's a central postmodern claim which arises from a very complex conundrum. And the conundrum is one that emerged in domains outside of the humanities, let's say. Although it emerged in the domain of literary criticism, because what happened in the mid-60s was that a very large number of disciplines simultaneously realized that it was actually technically impossible to perceive the world because there was an infinite number of ways that you could perceive the world. And so that bedeviled artificial intelligence. I mean, people thought for a long time that it would be easy to build machines that could see the world because there was the world and there were the objects, and figuring out what the objects were wasn't hard. It was maneuvering in the world that was hard. But that turned out to be wrong. It's really, really hard to figure out what the objects are, and we actually don't know how we do it. Now, you know, 50 years later, we have machines that can orient themselves pretty decently in the world, but they really had to be built in embodied form, and I won't pursue that. At the same time, psychologists who were working on perception ran into exactly the same conundrum because they figured out that they couldn't figure out how we could see things. And we're still sorting that out. And the literary critics figured out that there was no obvious canonical interpretation for a piece of literature. And that raised a specter, which was, well, if there's no obvious canonical interpretation, how do you know that one interpretation is better than the other? So out of that arose the postmodern notion that There's no grand narrative. There's no justifiable grand narrative. There's an infinite number of ways of interpreting the world, and there's no grand narrative. And fair enough. But, well, that raises the problem of value. Like, if there's no grand narrative, how do you orient yourself in the world? And the postmodern answer to that was, well, let's forget about the complexity of that problem and sneak our closet Marxism back into the game. And that was completely intellectually, I mean, I've been accused of failing to notice that there's a contradiction between postmodernism and Marxism. It's not like I failed to notice that. It's obvious that there's a contradiction, but it's equally obvious that the postmodernists, broadly speaking, is a thumbnail sketch, because they can't solve the problem of how to orient yourself in the world if there's an infinite number of interpretations, rely in a completely incomprehensible and paradoxical manner on the dictates of like a defunct 19th century philosophy to provide them with motive force in the world. So, and that's a non-tenable solution apart from being dangerous beyond belief, as the 20th century bears sufficient evidence to.
Just want to pause here to note that as a general matter of intellectual hygiene, if you find yourself interpreting your enemies as saying something deeply inconsistent that they don't explicitly say, it, you know, I don't know, it might be worth like pausing to consider whether it's possible that you got them wrong.
Yeah, I think that it's been a long time since anybody has pushed back on him intellectually in a way that he felt he had to engage with, right? And the great thing about, ironically, for somebody who wants to talk about the sovereign individual as the great secret recipe for human progress, his attitude towards people on the left is chimpish, right? There's your tribal collectivism right there, Jordan, Dr. Peterson, right? The way that you discuss, you can't even describe a left argument without just retching in disgust. Mm-hmm. And likewise, the way he talks about leftists, right? Well, go back to my saliva test joke in the chat.
Oh,
I wasn't actually. I didn't mean for you to do that. I apologize for disrupting the. But yeah,
I thought there was there, but yeah, go on.
The implication is that, right, if somebody commented that it's as though he believes there might be a genetic test for leftism, and I'm like, yeah, and if the indicator turns blue when you drop it in the saliva, euthanize the baby.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Like it just is incredible here that, you know, he thinks that people who, and like, remember, you know, Peterson, I mean, around this same time, right? I mean, when 12 Rules for Life, right? You know, the references in there to the postmodern neo-Marxists, like, you know, he's casting an incredibly wide net, right? You know, he thinks basically that like, everybody with green hair yelling at him about pronouns is a postmodern neo-Marxist, and you know, so he's admitting that the beliefs that he's attributing to these people are incredibly incoherent, right? You know, it's like they're internally inconsistent. But he's saying, well, nevertheless, that's what they think, and it's like, man, I mean, can't you, like, okay, if so, like, can we see some receipts on that? Like, you know, like you've got to, like, you know, just asserting that, like, yes, obviously they think this deeply inconsistent thing. Yeah, I mean, like, can you, in fact, as a year after this, Zizek would ask him, can you give me some examples? And he famously could not in that conversation. And then was a year or two later on Twitter, he actually did come up with a list, and the list is great. Luke Savage wrote an article about it for Jacobin, but the list includes people like Catherine McKinnon, who is actually extremely critical of both postmodernism and Marxism. But somehow she's on the list of the postmodern, Marxists. It's just, it's a settled fact in his head, right, that this deeply inconsistent combination of positions is what they all hold, and if it's just deeply, perversely, obviously incoherent, that just goes to show how perverse his enemies are, and nothing more to be said about it.
He anticipated the woke engine maintenance meme, where it's everything I don't like is woke, and if he doesn't like it, it's got to be neo-Marxist postmodernism, postmodern neo-Marxism, either, both, right? I'm surprised. That may be one reason why he doesn't actually talk a lot about foreign affairs, because it's harder to make that equivalency when it comes to ISIS or trade tensions with China. But
yeah, right.
He's found his dragon, and he's sticking with it.
Fair enough. Well, let's see him ride it to the end of this question.
So now, with regards to my conception of truth and whether it's postmodern, it's no, actually, it's not. So, and it's a very complicated thing to sort out, because there is more than one way of conceptualizing truth. There's truth as it's manifested in ethics, and there's truth as it's manifested in the description, let's say, of the objective material world, and how those two things touch is not something we've sorted out well. In the ethical world, what's happened is that an ethic has evolved over time, I would say, and that ethic is reflected in the central axioms of civilized human behavior, but you can also see deep echoes of it in animal behavior. And it seems to arise out of the fact that the interactions that take place among paired entities that have to interact repeatedly across time follow a set pattern. So one of the things that Jaak Panksepp discovered, for example, was that if you paired rats together to engage in rough and tumble play bouts, which you might not think is particularly relevant, but actually happens to be dead relevant, because that's a special circuitry, and it's part of the circuitry upon which human ethics are based. If you pair them together first, and one rat is bigger than the other, then the big rat wins. And so you think, well, play is dominated by power, and that's how it works in rats, and it's a power issue. But if you pair them together repeatedly, which is a much more naturalistic experiment, what you find is that once the large rat dominates the small rat has to ask the large rat to play. And if the large rat doesn't let the small rat win 30% of the time in repeated play bouts, then the small rat won't play anymore. And you think, well, so what? It's no, not so what. That's a major discovery. That's like Nobel Prize winning material, because what Panksepp demonstrated there was that there's an ethic of fair play emerges even among rats. All you have to do is pair them together. And there are rules that govern iterated ethical interactions that are emergent properties. And those emergent properties are manifested, as far as I can tell, described in the great mythological stories that we tell, in the great narratives that underlie our culture. And they're not based on arbitrary assumptions. They're based on observations of what furthered survival and reproduction, to speak in a purely Darwinian manner, over massive spans of time. And to point to truth as construed in a Darwinian realm, and to use the example of, say, iterated games to buttress that point, is by no means similar in any way to participating in the same process that the deconstructionists participate in. So I would say, well, on the side of the postmodernists, but not only the postmodernists, there are an indefinite number of ways of construing the world. that's being demonstrated technically. I don't think there's any debate about that. But there's a very constrained number of ways that you can operate successfully in the world. A very constrained number of ways. And it's not one way precisely, because it has its scope of variation, say, across culture and across environments, but it's very tightly constrained. Now, what's happened across the course of recorded history, let's say, is that ethic, and this is something Nietzsche observed when he was critiquing the history of Western philosophy, is that ethic manifested itself first at the level of behavior. We act it out. We don't understand it. Just like a chimpanzee troop acts out the ethic of their hierarchy. They can't represent it. They can't articulate it. The structure emerges. The structure and the behaviors that are associated with the structure emerge before that is represented, and certainly before it's articulated. So first of all, the ethic that governs repeated interactions at different scales of social interaction, the structure emerges first, and then it's mapped. And it's first mapped in image and story, and then it's articulated. And I would say, well, I talked earlier about the role that England has played, that the UK has played in articulating the political doctrine of the sovereign individual. But the idea of the sovereign individual is far older than those political articulations. And it's based in a narrative structure that is in turn based on the observation of behavioral patterns that have emerged reliably across time. And that's not postmodern in the least. It's a very straightforward claim that there is something that approximates a universal human ethic that's built deeply into our biological and social structures, and that was constructed in no small part as a consequence of Darwinian mechanisms. So,
thank you. So now we're...
Yeah, again, the original question was about truth. That what Peterson is doing, that the questioner was asking if this is, inviting him to reflect on whether this might be similar to the sort of things that, post-structuralist thinkers who he doesn't like might say, is that, things aren't true because they correspond to objective reality. They're true, for some other reason. And there was a lot going on in there, but, I don't feel like he ever really addressed the core of it. I mean, I guess the ultimate point is that it's not that any old narrative will do. It's only a narrative that's going to be helpful to us. And also there aren't going to be very many of those.
Yeah, I think the most charitable take that I could invent would be that he believes that there is some underlying metaphysical substrate to the observed world, which contains truth. And through the evolutionary process, that truth is revealed to the beings inhabiting that world. And when our ancestors became conscious enough to begin to verbalize the lessons imparted by the evolutionary process, right? Like rats learn the lessons but cannot verbalize them, which is why they have an ethic of fair play. But, it was our ancestors in the writing of the Bible or whatever, the Odyssey. I don't know what his canon is, right? Like, does he have the Justice League in there, or I mean, is he a Star Wars or a Star Trek? He's a Star Wars guy, obviously. Anyway, and those narratives are the way of passing along this survival enhancing insight into the underlying truths revealed through the evolutionary process. And for some reason that stops with the Bible or something, right? Like, or maybe the reason that Locke is so great, and I think that the way that he would say it is along a very Ben Shapiro, Jerusalem and Athens kind of way, that the genius of the Western tradition was it took those truths and that were embedded and concealed and kind of intuited in those ancestral narratives and brought them to a rational articulation in the form of the liberalism he likes and not the liberalism he doesn't like, which presumably comes from the chimp id and maybe the devil or something.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah, because otherwise his distinction, otherwise he is doing exactly what the postmodernists are saying, right? He's picking the Bible and these traditional wisdom books and creating his own hermeneutic of interpretation around them. And I don't know why is this the syllabus and not like the first, the top 10 entries in the IMDb ranking of Seinfeld episodes.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's right. Like, I mean, I think, maybe the first time I ever heard Jordan Peterson talk, I'm not 100% on this, but it was definitely around the time that, he started to, impinge more on my awareness, was when he went on Sam Harris's podcast. I don't think it was called Wake. Anyway, it's gone by a few different names, but he went on Sam Harris's podcast. And, Sam Harris is somebody who I don't like. I think I've been pretty clear on that over the years. But I've never felt as much sympathy for Sam Harris as I felt while I was listening to this conversation, because it wasn't really what was intended as the main subject, but it ended up being 90% about this truth stuff. And it mostly consisted of Harris trying to sort of tease out and, trying to get Peterson to see that it was possible that something could be true, even though knowing it wasn't useful, or, even though, or that that true beliefs could actually have bad consequences. And, they went through all these examples about, like, if there's a leak from a chemical weapons lab that ends up, wiping out all life on Earth, that doesn't mean the theory of chemistry they were working with wasn't true, and things like that. Yeah. And I my heart really went out to him, because, like, in that conversation, Harris came off like nothing so much as a harried and underpaid adjunct professor trying to explain an incredibly basic distinction to the world's most confused undergraduate.
I think that Peterson feels as though his Jungianism gives him some, he doesn't need that logic bullshit, man. He's mainlining truth straight from the source. So, right, like, don't get your, go read Hegel, nerd, right? Like, Peterson, the professor, is going to riff on the Odyssey or something, and then complain about trans people.
Well, we've got more of that to look forward to, and
especially the complaining about trans people.
That's exactly. We haven't even gotten to that tonight. We do have more of that to get to, but we are going to take a few minutes break and then be back in the post game for patrons. If you are one of those, you should have an email with that YouTube link. If you aren't, then you should really take the time to consider how you're living your life and whether you could be, doing it better. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.